Thank you for joining Politics Plus Media 101, hosted by Justin Higgins and myself, John Gunnison. For today's episode, we are joined by Scott Kennedy, a senior advisor and the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Fresh off a trip to China, Scott joined us to discuss the Chinese Communist Party Congress, the zero COVID policy and its impact on China's domestic economy, and the future of the U.S. China commercial relationship. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Scott, good evening here. We are recording Monday before the U.S. midterms. I just wanted to thank you very much for joining us. We know you were recently over in China. How was your trip?
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be with both of you. I had a blast. I mean, it's not the easiest thing to get to China. It took me over 160 days from the time I left my door in April to when I got out of quarantine in September. I did go a few other places. I went home, I repacked, and it takes a while to take a while to get there. And of course, who wants to be, in quarantine for 10 days in China? My quarantine experience went better compared to how it could have gone and how some others have gone. But I knew all that going in, that it was difficult to get there. It would not be, a plush vacation, but it was really worth it. It reconfirmed my view that Zoom is a danger to mankind. Not Zoom just itself, but online meeting platforms give you the sense of intimacy, which is totally really not there. And that until you get on the ground and meet people face to face, you have a much less clear sense of what's really happening, and they don't have a clear sense of what you're thinking. So I think U.S. China relations didn't nosedive because we've not been talking to each other face to face. I mean, there's other things, Taiwan, technology, Ukraine, you name it. Issues are really long, but we're certainly not going to fix any of them or put a floor under the relationship until we do get face to face more regularly. And that was confirmed for me by the trip, how valuable it is, how much hunger there is there for people to talk to us. So I came away thinking that the reason for me going was justified by my experience, as complicated as it was.
So then, coming out of that and meeting with people face to face, and you mentioned that there were some communications wires that are crossed just because of Zoom and things like virtual meeting spaces. Are you more hopeful that U.S. China relations will, quote unquote, normalize now that we're, moving away from the pandemic? President Biden has declared it over here in the United States. And eventually you would have to assume that the Chinese society and government would also move on. So are we more hopeful now because the lines of communication will be different, that can lead to breakthroughs, however incremental?
I don't know. I came away recognizing where the Chinese stand on different positions. I have a better sense of that than before I went. I also have a better sense of the policy debate in China and sort of the room for maneuver that they have, how they keep score, their worries about our credibility in making a deal. And I have a sense of that on this side as well. And I can now see a pathway, but I still think there's a lot of reasons why one ought to be pessimistic. So I come away thinking we've got like a 5 to 10% chance to right the ship. And for that, I think in Beijing and Washington, I'm seen as a crazy, crazy idealist. Don Quixote tilting at windmills. It's there. It's just really difficult for us to figure it out. It's going to require some significant adjustments. But we might be able to get the ball rolling if we would just figure out ways to get in the same room with each other on a more regular basis. More Americans going back to China, Chinese coming here and traveling other places. So I think goal number one is, how do you get beyond zero COVID in China? That is really hanging over their economy, over their politics, over their relationship with the rest of the world. We've got to find a way to get to the other side of this. So while you and I and most of the world is in a post-pandemic mindset and reality, China's still in the middle of this dang thing. I can't tell you how different it feels when you're on the ground there, and you've got to use this device. I'm holding up a cell phone for those who can't see, to get into any building, including your own. To get into a taxi, you've got to scan. And of course, to scan to show that you're negative, you've got to test. And so that really is a big inhibitor on people being in trouble. I say, if you don't speak Chinese, have a Chinese cell phone number, a WeChat account, etc. Going to China now is absolutely impossible. So, and it's very hard for them to travel. Even Chinese who want to have a difficult time getting their passports back or getting permission from their government to leave. So this isolation that China is now imposed on itself vis-a-vis the rest of the world, it is genuinely dangerous for all of us, on top of all the substantive areas where we are at loggerheads.
So, Scott, when other countries around the world put in even milder forms of restrictions on social conduct and mobility because of COVID, in the United States, in Europe, what we refer to as lockdowns, maybe exaggerating at times. Although you could say that in Italy, they had something like a lockdown at the beginning of COVID. But when these countries put in place these policies, the public were quite upset in a lot of cases. There were big protests in Europe and the United States against restrictive policies around COVID. How are the people in China reacting? What did the public think about zero COVID?
That's really, really interesting, John. And one of the most surprising things I found when I was there is how similar the conversation in China at the popular level is from the conversation in the United States, and how different those conversations are from some of China's neighbors. Remember, I couldn't visit China in the spring because of the Shanghai lockdown, didn't want to be stuck in a hotel for 6 to 7 weeks doing nothing. So I went instead to Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. And of course, they've been going through their own transitions out of their own zero COVID. And I'll come back to them in a second. But basically, I found the conversations there very different from the US and China. And that's a total shocker, because China is all about social control, not about emphasizing vaccines. And we're all about vaccines and no social control, at least post-Easter 2020, right? That was when President Trump said, Easter, it's all over. You all can go do what you want. Now, of course, we've had wasn't quite like that, but largely that contrast holds. But the conversation, the level of skepticism, disagreements, arguments, anger, questioning authority, the same in both places. I met so many Chinese that are now their own virologists, their own epidemiologists. They're going online, reading the exact same articles that folks who are vaccine hesitant in the United States are reading. The exact same ones. They'll cite the same ones, like word for word. And so in China, I guess, once you've been there for a while, you learn how to take a test and scan, and it's inconvenience. But most folks really find it a significant intrusion. And so they're pretty angry about that, especially since the Shanghai lockdown and the consequences that had for the country, and since the rest of the world has moved beyond COVID with vaccines and a whole bunch of other measures. So most people around the country are pretty upset, I would say. In Shanghai, where I went, they were both upset and depressed, because Shanghai went through 2 to 3 months of lockdown, amazingly traumatic experience for just about everybody. Even if you made it through fine and you were able to work with friends to get whatever supplies you needed and food and stuff shipped to your apartment or house or whatever, lock yourself in a small apartment for 2 to 3 months alone, or with your family, where you always need space from. And that was really hard on people. Of course, they're also paying attention to what's going on outside. And that was just amazingly stressful. And so I found people are actually still traumatized when I was there. And this, and they're at their jobs. They're working in hotels, they're taxi drivers, they're in stores, but it's still something that they're working their way through. And China continues to have cases and then lockdowns. And so I think it's really not because we're complaining about international relations and the isolation. But Chinese themselves, I think, are just fed up with this and want to turn the page some way. They want to turn the page safely. They don't want to just open up and this, let there be a lot more cases and deaths. But they want to find a way to get to the other side. And if 190 other countries can find a way to do it, then they'd like to. And the U.S. isn't the model here, as we all know. But China's neighbors, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, whatever you want to call it, whatever status you want to give it, those three places did a pretty darn good job of shifting from their own zero COVID strategies, which were not as draconian as China's, to massive increase in vaccinations, social distancing, taking turns about who would be in the office, who would be at home, fantastic public education campaigns. So they did have an increase in cases, but a very small increase in severe illness and death because they really did it the right way. I think the Chinese are, if you want a model out there, South Korea is probably the best. They had a very, very small number of fatalities relative to number of cases. And so, of course, China, anything is going to be a big number because of the population, but they have a way to get through the other side. And I think it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I know once they do get to the other side, people will feel much better because right now it's uncertainty in every direction as far as the eye can see.
Scott, it's pretty fascinating to hear you talk about how openly people in China are expressing their discontent about zero COVID. Certainly the international stereotype, the international perspective about China is that the people generally trust the government authority and don't complain openly about all of its policies. Maybe that's wrong. We see the images in Hong Kong, the autonomous city of protests, and we hear about how it's possible in Hong Kong, but you would never see it in the mainland. Maybe that's a misunderstanding of China and how people do express their discontent. But it does make you wonder, are there cracks in the authority of the system that are starting to emerge or grow?
I think this is a humongous issue that we're having a difficult time getting ourselves around because in our view and a lot of the world's views, China's political system is illegitimate. It's not based on the consent of the governed. And therefore, any type of protest would be a threat to the system. And China's watched color revolutions around it and elsewhere. And I think the Communist Party itself is highly anxious. They're way more anxious than they need to be. China's richer, stronger, healthier, more influential than ever. Yet they feel like they're victims and, being attacked from all sides. And from including from within. But I'm impressed that, obviously in public situations, people have to be ridiculously careful. And I saw a lot of funny exhibitions of pro Xi Jinping type comments that people would make because they know everyone's keeping score and you've got to demonstrate that. On the other hand, behind the scenes, I think people are more open and thoughtful. And they do read broadly and widely. They've traveled. I mean, this is the benefit of 40 years of openness and interdependence between China and the rest of the world. Probably one thing that is going to sort of constrain Xi Jinping's effort to reshape the international order and change his neighborhood. And it's partly the U.S. and what we do with our alliance system and everything else. But the biggest constraint on fundamentally changing the direction of Chinese society successfully is 40 years of economic reform and liberalization and interdependence that has changed Chinese society fundamentally. They don't want to be locked down like this and treated like this. They are the ones putting pressure, perhaps very gingerly, very lightly, very careful in how they word things, but they're not comfortable with that either. And so you find people expressing their opinion to you. They're also exiting. Some people are exiting China. If you look at, search trends, immigration is one of the biggest search trends recently. But even domestically, let's say, most people aren't going to leave the country. Of course, they're going to stay there. We all stay in our hometowns most of the time. But exiting from the popular conversation, from the focus on politics and from all of that stuff, I mean, people are taking up hobbies and running and bicycling and climbing and going to bars. And doing lots of stuff that keeps them away from having to pay attention to what's going on in the political system. So I think you're seeing the consequences of 40 years of significant social change. I think that's positive. It's going to be really hard for Xi Jinping to reorder this into a control state that looks like North Korea. That he may feel more comfortable that way. The Chinese people aren't going to let him.
Let's transition into this discussion then. And I think the way to do it, Scott, is to have you explain for us and our audience what the Party Congress is, just so we can wrap our mind around that and then get into it, because largely it's seen as potentially not a tipping point, but a point where consolidation was made very clear.
So China's run by the Chinese Communist Party, and every 5 years the party gets together for a very big party with a small p to review the progress of the last 5 years and to anoint the leadership for the next 5. They have several thousand delegates that show up in Beijing that select a new central committee of 300, 400 people. And that group, that central committee, theoretically chooses the new Politburo and the new Politburo Standing Committee. Now, we know it works in reverse, that the leaders tell the central committee what to do, and that's how you get the new leadership. So personnel selection is one of the key jobs of a party Congress. The second is to lay down the party line. Here's our analysis of what's happened. Here's our direction. Here's what's good. Here's what's bad. Here's what we've got to do. Here's the mission. And and so Xi Jinping gave a speech at the very beginning of the Party Congress on October 16th. They then had meetings throughout that week where they drummed in again and again what the big message ought to be. At the very end of the Party Congress, a week later, they issued a communique that said it again. And then the next day, they held the first plenum of the new 20th Party Congress that elected the new leadership that then put forward those points again. So highly consequential. It's how China really selects its leaders. In this time, it really broke the mold for how they had gone about things in the past. This Xi Jinping is now beginning his third term as general secretary of the Communist Party. And for the last 40 years, essentially, they agreed through their own sort of self-restraint that you'd only serve 2 terms, then you'd retire. And we saw that in his 2 predecessors, Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, and even before them. So he's now said, to heck with that. I'm going to serve longer. And it might be a 3rd term, 4th term, who knows, 5th. In American politics, he's a young politician. He's only 69. So he could be there for a while. In addition, it used to be that for all leaders, if you were 68 or older, you'd retire. If you're 67 or younger, you'd stay on. So it's the 7 up, 8 down rule, they call it. And there's a few folks in the leadership who were under 60, 68 who are now going to be retired, and a few others, in addition to Xi Jinping, who are older, who are going to stick around. So basically got rid of that rule. And all the folks that they chose to be in the Politburo and Standing Committee are good buddies of Xi Jinping, part of his cohort of loyal lieutenants. No balance in the selection of leaders. And an interesting thing, just math. The new Politburo has 24 members. The previous one had 25. 2 things come out from that. There is now no woman on the new Politburo. They didn't see a need to even genuflect in the direction of gender equality. 24-1 is not equal, but they, in the past, had appointed at least one female member of the Politburo, who and they didn't see the need to do that, and they chose the number 24. Now, they typically would choose an odd number in case there needed to be a tie-breaking vote on something. Now they say, well, there doesn't need to be a vote on anything. There's just one person that votes. So Xi Jinping ran the table and then he broke the table. And that's a new era for Chinese politics. I'll just say one thing about like watching it in person when I'm being in China is that in the past, and I've gone to China for over 30 years. In the past, you could go to a few dinners when you're in Beijing and have a few drinks with people, and you'd come away with a pretty reasonable story about what you thought would going to happen in the party Congress. This time, people didn't know jack squat. They have tightened up that political system, and people would tell you who they hoped would be appointed or who they feared would be appointed. But everyone admitted they didn't know anything. And that's a change in how Chinese politics works.
So, Scott, something that we've noticed looking around the world is that even in places that don't have competitive multi-party elections, you still, of course, have politics. In Saudi Arabia, we saw how the crown prince consolidated power, competing with other princes, the clerical authorities. Even in the UK, the last two prime ministers were named not through elections, but through politics inside of the Conservative Party. And I imagine that in China, it's similar, that inside the Communist Party of China, you've got politics, you've got factions and competition. So when we hear that Xi has consolidated power, could you tell us a little bit about what that means? What are the other factions that exist and compete inside the Communist Party that he's had to push down?
Well, it would be nice if I could tell you and really know for sure that official A, B, and C are part of Xi's faction and D, E, F are part of Hu Jintao's faction, the gentleman who was unpolitely ushered from the stage at the end of the party Congress. And that's an interesting story in and of itself. We might be overreading it, but it's suggestive of what the trend is. But in any case, certainly Xi Jinping decided to choose people that he had worked with for quite a long time before he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of all of China. And he previously served in Fujian province, which is the province right across from Taiwan. He also served in the province of Zhejiang, which is just north of Fujian, just south of Shanghai. It's where Alibaba and lots of China's most successful private high-tech companies are from. And you would have thought that maybe Xi Jinping would have a place in his heart for private companies. Obviously not, as we're seeing. Big question is, where is Jack Ma? Everyone wants to know where Jack Ma is. He's fine. He's in Mallorca, I believe, living quietly. But in any case, but the people that he did bring into the leadership now all worked with him at some point in the past. And he knows them. And there's a really interesting picture of him you can see from really far back with Li Qiang, who's the party secretary of Shanghai, who a lot of people thought no way he'd get the number 2 job because of the Shanghai lockdown and all the craziness that ensued. But obviously that didn't matter to Xi Jinping. They've known each other for a really long time. And so he got that job. I don't like to overstate the importance of factions as aligned with certain types of policy ideas, liberals versus conservatives. But there's certain, that personal tie, those personal ties matter a lot. And Xi Jinping himself really is not a friend of markets. He really believes in raw power against raw power. He believes in control, exerting as much as he can. And so we're going to see China go in that direction. And all the folks that he's brought along with him, they will try to effectively implement that vision and to some extent practice some amount of pragmatism. I don't think that Xi Jinping is Kim Jong-un with a different hairdo. I think he doesn't want to simply drive their economy off the cliff. That is still important. Part of politics in China is about success and achievement. Growth still matters, even though other things matter as well. And so they will try to figure out how to improve the economy. I don't think they want a war over Taiwan, but it's going to be messy. And who's going to be telling Xi Jinping the truth about the economy, about zero COVID, about how the rest of the world views China? It's dicey. Do you want to upset the boss, or do you want to keep your job and keep your head down? That's a real big challenge for a system where there is one person in charge who is the emperor of everything. And so even although in Saudi politics and others, including in China, bureaucracy matters, local governments matter, the importance of this one individual does make a difference. And so we've got to figure out how he ticks and what that means for the rest of the country and for us.
Scott, you're touching on something that I wanted to ask about, actually, and that's how the consolidation of power is impacting the quality and caliber of expertise around the decision makers. Because we have seen, just like you described, in places like Turkey, that when a leader gets entrenched and they tighten the circle of advisors, maybe lackeys, toadies, family members, yes men, the quality of economic advice becomes worse. And I'm wondering if that might be happening in China. We asked some Russia experts if this was happening in Russia, and they said that even though Putin has entrenched himself for so long, he's still got a very high caliber of economic advisors who he's empowered to make decisions. I don't know how they've managed to do that, because this is a problem that we keep seeing. But how would you evaluate China's navigation of this problem? Do you think that there's still sharp economic people that are advising Xi, or is he closing his ears off to anything other than dogma?
Obviously, there are factions, people with different relationships with him and with other leaders. And at the same time, if you want to get to the top spots in Chinese politics, you're going to have gone through that system for a very, very long time. You would have been evaluated every single year on your performance over the region that you're responsible for, over the issue. And so even though there's a great deal of loyalty associated with who gets chosen, these also tend to be relatively smart, capable people across the board. Most of them are not dummies and idiots. There may be a few. Every political system has them. I could think of probably a few people in the American political system that somehow squoze through, or even I was a professor for a long time. Professors or in think tank land, we all know those, and I myself make plenty of mistakes. So I'm not immune to that problem at all. But I would say that I think the question isn't whether they'll be smart enough, but will they be willing to think outside the box and come up with data and answers that may not confirm his preferences for the direction of policy? Will they be willing to go even one step further and say, here's a creative solution to the challenges that we face? One of China's best economic technocrats ever was their former central bank governor, Zhou Xiaochuan, who over the course of a decade plus figured out strategies to persuade China's top leaders that moving forward with financial liberalization reduced risks to China's economy. That's really difficult. Most of the time, the natural inclination of China's leaders would be to pull back, to reduce the effect of markets. But with regard to monetary policy, creation of the bond market, lots of different things, Zhou was a master in framing issues in a way that made liberalization, the marketization, the best choice to reduce risk from the perspective of China's leaders. And I don't know if China's next central bank governor or the head of their banking regulator or the securities regulator is going to have that ability to envision how they can play a role in shaping economic policy in a constructive direction. That's what I'm really worried about. I think we're going to know the answer to that question in a couple stages. The first is in December. China will hold a economic work conference. It will review the work status of the economy and set goals. We'll see to what extent they evaluate things in a reasonable way. And then next March, when they hold their annual legislative session, they will pick the new leadership for the government. 20th Party Congress, which they held in October, was leadership for the party. Now in March, they'll choose the leaders for the government, and we'll get to see who is going to be the head of the central bank, securities regulator, planning for the economic for industrial policy. That'll give us a sense of whether we're likely to see people with personalities that are imbued with some sense of a vision beyond just simply confirming Xi Jinping's wishes. And then we'll watch them implement it. So I really look forward to seeing how they tackle those things. I think if there's a bigger problem, if there's one big problem, which I don't know how they're going to deal with, and that may not be resolved by who gets what job, it's clear now that Xi Jinping is not just focused on China growing faster. In addition to that, he wants there to be greater equity. He wants the economy to be less carbon producing. There's a variety. He also is really interested in national security and domestic security. So he's got 4 or 5 big goals. Also, of course, no one can die from COVID, right? So you got 5 big goals that you want to achieve at the same time. How do you get officials who are looking up at you for approval to know which of these things to focus on and how to do them all at the same time if you don't clarify? So I think the increasing lack of clarity about what the top priority is going to be perhaps the most difficult thing for officials, regardless of how smart they are, to figure out how to operate in the system.
And that was going to be my next question, because you had alluded to other priorities in addition to economic growth and economic factors, that there are other priorities domestically. So before we get into the foreign policy, which we will touch on very shortly here, I was hoping you could shed some light into, and again, this is a new set of people and really a consolidation, it sounds like. So maybe we don't know. But with potential shifts that are coming up, population cliff and the ramifications of zero COVID on the economy, we have global inflation rising potentially as a result. And you've alluded to and outright said there is some public dissension, even if people are doing so in a muted way. So I guess the question is, how do we understand that this type of government and maybe the new people in this government will be attuned to or concerned about public sentiment? And assuming that there are a lot of capable people, and you said the problem isn't that, it's whether they're willing to tell the truth, do we think that that will trickle up to Xi Jinping? And if it does, how is he going to deal with this? You mentioned that this is a loaded question, but you mentioned that he likes hard power. Would he be the type of person to come crashing down on any type of dissent, or would he handle it in a more nuanced way?
Great questions. I don't mean to be Swami and anticipate every question that you guys are going to ask, but it's clear. I think we've got a common sense of kind of where this conversation ought to be going, and I think we're going that way. I don't think that Xi Jinping and the Communist Party is totally indifferent to public sentiment in China, and they want to know. They just don't want to know through accountable elections where they might lose. So instead of that, they have a whole variety of other ways to keep tabs on folks. First of all, like I said, everyone's got one of these phones, and there's a lot of accessibility to these phones and what happens on them that the party can make use of. There's cameras everywhere, right? They do conduct surveys. There are polling companies which the party and the government hire at the national and local level to do surveys all the time for people. Questions come on your cell phone. You don't know that it's a Communist Party asking you. You think it's some survey company, and you answer it. But that data goes back to officials who use that as a way to see what sentiment is. In addition, they do a lot of big data and analytics. So, for example, China's hotline to complain about stuff, 12345. That's you dial 12345, and then you get to the hotline. You can complain and whine about whatever the heck you want to. So those calls are recorded. They can see where the calls come from, and that's a bunch of data. You give that to a big data analytics company. They can say, you know what, in October of 2022, everybody was complaining about having to scan their phones in zero COVID, or 50% of people complained about it, but the other half said, boy, I'm really glad we got this because we've got a lot less people dying, or they're talking about something else. So there's a variety of different ways that they can try and take the pulse of society. Some of it is kind of scary Big Brother stuff, but others is stuff that people anywhere would think is smart if you've got a lot of pollsters and available data out there. Now, they don't necessarily see themselves as accountable to that information. That just feeds into what they want to do. And then so they can decide, you know what, gosh darn it, we really think that we need this fight with the U.S. We're in the struggle with the U.S., for example, and therefore what we've got to do is persuade people that they've got to sacrifice X, Y, and Z, maybe not traveling or, et cetera. And so that gives them guidance. They don't necessarily cave to public opinion, but they know how to adapt to address it. And then they can do surveys and polls and look what people are searching for online and know if they're getting any traction. So they can do a lot of that type of temperature taking. Is he cracked down? Ask the people in Hong Kong, right? Ask folks in Xinjiang. Ask folks who did not want to go to centralized quarantine in Shanghai. I don't think they have any qualms about crushing certain kinds of dissent when absolutely necessary to show everybody else who's boss. On the other hand, I don't think that's their preferred way. I think they'd rather accept voluntary compliance or some type of negotiated outcome most of the time, or just making people happier or persuading them to be happy. I would say China's happiness index actually is pretty low. I think it ranks like 90th in the world. So they've got a lot to do on that score. But do they care? Do they pay attention? Yes. Do they want to be held accountable? No. Are they willing to be tough if they have to? Absolutely.
So, Scott, based on everything that we've been saying so far, it seems like China might be taking a bit of an inward focus in this next stage. Zero COVID, obviously, has made China much more domestically focused. In the previous 10 years, we heard so much about China's global ambitions, especially as expressed through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been discussed so widely, so ubiquitously in global and American press. I'm curious, with the new inward turn of China at this time, where does the Belt and Road Initiative stand? Is it still as an important part of China's grand strategy?
That's a great question. The Belt and Road is a Christmas tree upon which different politicians, including Xi Jinping, have hung different ornaments to make it into whatever they wanted to be. When they announced Belt and Road in 2013, it was supposed to be simply an outward investment plan that would help China move up the value-added chain. They would take declining industries in China, move them to other places. It would help China connect to the rest of the Eurasian landmass. And gradually over time, they tinkered with this thing, changed its name in English, and they also changed what its goals were. And then it became all about infrastructure. And then they started announcing these big, giant infrastructure projects around the region, all the way to Europe. And then it was supposed to go beyond Europe to Belt and Road to Latin America. There's the Arctic Belt and Road. I think people even suggest there's a space Belt and Road. I'm curious about how folks get there. But nevertheless, this whole thing has changed dynamics over time. I think in 2017 and 18, the first real big problems that the Belt and Road ran into when China domestically ran into severe financial headwinds. And as a result, all that money they thought they were sitting on that they could pour into the Belt and Road dried up. They figured, you know what, we actually need this cash at home because now is the rainy day. We've got financial institutions that are wobbling, and we've got to be much more careful with our renminbi. And so outward foreign investment slowed down. Then you get the pandemic, which further constrained potential outward investment. And then you saw, in addition to that kind of problem, reports on several kinds of cases where the investments didn't work out well. And you got, like in Sri Lanka, airport and ports that didn't pan out. And it was just, they went bust. And then you start hearing about, China's debt trap that they were trying to create countries to fall into. And so I think all of those things translate into the Belt and Road being essentially now a shell of its former self. There's a lot less outward Chinese investment than there was in the past. And they're being much more careful in how they talk about it. They haven't abandoned the language. Like, you don't ever hear any Chinese talk about Made in China 2025 anymore, but they still talk about the Belt and Road. It's still high on the discussion list, but its scale is a lot smaller. And so does that mean that China's effort to influence the international system is drawing back, combined with the other types of isolationist tendencies? I don't think so. I still think that they want to become and be significant players on the international stage. But I do think that they'll need to be more selective and careful. This is a learning experience in which they made some progress, but also some mistakes. China definitely wants to shape the rules of the global internet to justify government intervention whenever they can. They want the world to accept that industrial policy basically should be unconstrained, even though the WTO's current rules say that there should be limits to distortionary spending that affects other trading countries. The Chinese want the UN to be seen as the dominant multilateral institution relative to others, and they want state sovereignty to be protected. So I still think that they're going to be pushing on those kinds of things, but I think their pocketbook is a little bit more constrained than it used to be. Now, if they can revive growth and improve their relations with Europe and other parts of the world, we may see a recovery in Chinese spending and a new lease on life for the Belt and Road. But for right now, it's a much narrower belt, a much smaller road.
I just find that hilarious almost. And it's because over the last few years, we've been talking on this program about Belt and Road Initiative extensively. And right as the pandemic was going, it seemed like a lot of folks in the US didn't know much about it. So it was viewed as this silver bullet that was going to advance Chinese soft power across, large swaths of the world. And the US could basically do nothing to counter it. Do you think that the initial praise for the Belt and Road Initiative was overblown, or has it just slowed down due to external factors and it's running into a different set of realities? Because the praise felt like it was universal.
Yeah, it did. I agree. If you remember, before they announced the Belt and Road just itself, they announced the creation of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, AIB. And, Washington went berserk over what was supposed to be this new institution that was going to overturn the rules of international aid and development assistance. The U.S. wouldn't join it. It was really upset that Great Britain and others did. And I think in some ways, by focusing so heavily on it, we were China's best advertising for how influential they were. And certainly the Chinese Communist Party, one of their key strategies to increase China's influence is to highlight the shadow of the future. They do what every good engager in a military coup does. They go take the radio station, the TV station, they broadcast, we're in charge, even if they're still not, but they want everyone to believe that they will be, and then put down their arms and let the coup win. The Chinese do that on talking about China's peaceful rise. The whole idea of the peaceful rise is, hey, we are inevitably going to be bigger. You all just ought to get along with that and accept it. Peace thing being, don't be too afraid that this reality is coming. And I think Belt and Road, we just thought, wow, look at that dang big map. Look at those big dollar signs, the China Development Bank, China AIB. This is going to, we can't possibly compete with this stuff. And I think the Chinese benefited from that because they got so many countries to sign up to the Belt and Road and sign MOUs with them. On the other hand, when it didn't fully deliver as planned, it then looks bad. So does that mean that we shouldn't have been concerned in the first place? No, I mean, maybe we shouldn't have given it quite the, page A1 top of fold attention that it got. Maybe it should have been, the business section back of the page, and then, leave it to technocrats to criticize. But I think Chinese diplomacy has strengths and it has weaknesses. And those weaknesses are usually self-imposed weaknesses. Wolf warrior diplomacy can get folks to say yes to stuff, but it means that they're a lot less happy about it. And their implementation isn't going to be as universally good. If you just go back to January 2017, right? Davos, Xi Jinping goes to Davos. President Trump stays home. Xi Jinping gives this kick-ass speech. He says, we are going to be the stewards of global economic governance. We're going to address all these problems that are out there. Hey, look to our colleagues who are not here anymore. Man, and if Xi Jinping had implemented half of the 10% of what was in that speech in a reasonably constructive way, while the U.S. was going into its own isolationist cocoon, man, China would be kicking ass today. They would be cleaning up. We'd be in their rearview mirror, far behind. Instead, they bumbled it. Their anxieties about threats from within, threats from without, pushed them in a direction where they ended up being their own worst enemies on their amount of international influence. And how they handled the Belt and Road is a great example of that.
We're on a mind meld here because I was thinking about how maybe a lot of the concerns were from the U.S. going into our own isolationist period. Not only Trump, but the Freedom Caucus was attacking the XM Bank and TPP, and then Trump got elected. But to shift to President Biden and really the U.S. foreign policy, President Biden has been reestablishing the United States on the world stage in a variety of ways. You know, the Ukraine is an example of the Ukraine war, AUKUS, and we could list off a bunch of different things. But one area where he has been similar to his predecessor, and some would argue much more strict, is a lot of his trade policy towards China. And on October 7th, he and the administration announced some new export controls on semiconductors. So I was wondering if you could kind of explain what those policies look like, and not only what those policies look like, but how they fit into the larger approach from this Biden administration. What goals are they trying to accomplish, and why are those goals important to how we are trying to rebalance against China in this new competition?
Sure. If you look broadly between the Trump administration and Biden administration, you see lots of differences in many different areas. And on China, you see some surprising continuity. I think there's, in ways, lots of continuity, but also some significant differences that just deserve to be pointed out. Yes, in May of 2019, in June of 2018, Trump launched the trade war, unilateral tariffs, 4 rounds of tariffs. In May of 2019, the first sanctions on Huawei. A year later, expanded those sanctions on Huawei, added other Chinese companies to the entity list. But then in January of 2020, the U.S. and China reached this phase 1 agreement that he declared as a victory and overcome all of this first president to ever defeat China at the negotiating table. And on January 15th, 2021, when they officially signed the deal, I would have expected 2020 to be a quiet year in U.S. China relations. President Trump would have campaigned on him slaying the Chinese dragon, and it would have been, a happy parade. Instead, a week later, pandemic starts. It looks like it's going to be a domestic pandemic in China, and then it actually explodes to become a global pandemic, including in the U.S. And President Trump decides, you know what? I'm not going to celebrate this deal with China. Instead, I'm going to blame them for the global pandemic and all its consequences. And what we got was 10 months of sanction against China. As far as the eye can see, 200 plus actions. And that's what Biden inherited, right? Which would not have occurred without the pandemic. It would have been quite different. Now, of course, there's lots of folks inside the administration in different halls who had it in for China and were just thrilled that the president used this awkward excuse to be able to do whatever they wanted to do. But nevertheless, that's the domestic politics side. That's why why Biden inherited that legacy of action after action and sanction. I think what that shows is that for Trump, the fight with China was really about himself and about sort of this arm wrestling match. For the Biden administration, they really believe that there is a conflict between these two very different political and social systems. This is genuinely ideological for them. So this is a fight which they aren't doing because they think it helps President Biden politically. They think this is a genuine contest for what should be the rules of the road domestically and globally, and our system or their system. But one thing that is consistent amongst people inside the Trump administration and today, leaving aside the sort of domestic politics, is that, and we touched upon it a little bit, is that the view that interdependence with China is a bad thing. Now, they're highly anxious about globalization in general, but interdependence with China specifically, they are deeply worried about, and they see a zero-sum relationship between commercial access and American national security. It's a very simple equation. Reduce commercial connectivity, increase American national security. And so in October, the administration took a big step in that direction. The Department of Commerce issued some new rules, putting severe constraints on the selling of American semiconductors and semiconductor equipment that uses American technology to China. Now, they set a very high bar. Only the most advanced semiconductors and semiconductor equipment that helps make those advanced semiconductors, but also the people, Americans that work in China, trying to use that equipment, all restricted. So the administration's description of this is called small yard high fence. Small yard high fence. It means the U.S. is only going to restrict a very narrow number of technologies, but they're going to close absolutely every single loophole to have them be provided to China. In their view, in order to maintain America's advantage over China, as far as they can see, they really have to crack down on these specific technologies being shared with China. Now, the concern by some is that, are they going to stop? Is this the last thing? Is it just semiconductors? What about in pharmaceuticals or in energy or in aerospace? Where's the end of this? Is it really going to be a small yard high fence, or is it going to be a lot of small yards and high fences, and eventually we have barely any commercial relationship with China? The second concern that folks have is that while the U.S. is doing this unilaterally, is the rest of the world going to go along? Will we end up isolating ourselves more than the Chinese? Because if they can go buy stuff from somewhere else, they will end up being the ones that are more isolated. Now, in semiconductors, we tend to really have a stranglehold on this industry, top to bottom. And if we say folks have to go along, it'll really be hard for them not to, because if the U.S. denies them certain semiconductor equipment or tools, really the whole industry stops. So, but in most other industries, we don't have that unilateral stranglehold. So we have to be really careful that we don't over-isolate ourselves. The second reason that people are concerned about this is if you only focus on the gap between the U.S. and China, you still might get policy wrong. There may be national security benefits from being connected to China commercially that actually still enhance your advantage relative to China. I'll just give you a small example of this. China buys our chips. If we give them to them, if we sell them basically most of what they need for commercial purposes, obviously the stuff for military side, you need to be much more careful and restrictive on. But let's say we sell them chips for processors that go into operating systems for laptops and phones and all that stuff. You want the Chinese to be addicted to your chips and your chip ecosystem as much as possible. And as long as you can keep them inside your ecosystem, typically they are lower down in the hierarchy of that system. And it's very difficult for them to leapfrog ahead of you. In addition, because they're in your ecosystem, you gain a tremendous amount of information about what the Chinese can do and what they can't do. If one consequence of our current restrictions is that the Chinese decide to go it alone in semiconductors or aerospace or pharma or pick your other sector, we'll slow them down for a while, but at some point they may figure it out and they may create their own hierarchy with themselves at the top, and they may be much harder to understand because we're not part of that ecosystem. So there are pluses and minuses to the strategy that the Biden administration has chosen, and it may work out, but it may end up making us less secure and poor at the same time, which is not what their intention is. It's a very hard call on all of these technologies, what to do. And of course, the Chinese don't make it any easier by the way they act and the way they talk. And so wanting to constrain them makes total sense. We just need to make sure we do it in the most effective way possible.
So, Scott, Taiwan are a major player in the global semiconductor industry. If China cannot get access to semiconductors because of U.S. policy, Might that actually encourage China to take aggressive action against Taiwan?
Another great question. This is a fun conversation. So certainly, Taiwan is the world's dominant leader of manufacturing semiconductors. TSMC may be the most important company on the planet because just about all of the big orders, especially for the most advanced chips, are manufactured by TSMC, uh, uh, which is what folks in the semiconductor industry call a pure play foundry. TSMC doesn't design chips. They take designs that others like Qualcomm or other companies, NVIDIA, send them, and then they punch out the chips. And they can do that better than anybody else. They're just focused on that one mission. I visited TSMC in April. Amazingly impressive company that is just ahead of the competition. And in some ways, you might say, well, geez, if the U.S. denies China this technology, they're just going to look at that small little island 100 miles away at those nice fabs and decide, you know what, this has got to be ours. Luckily, they understand that that wouldn't get them diddly because an attack on Taiwan would most likely, could very well destroy those fabs. But let's just imagine for a second the Chinese are, precision attackers. They keep the U.S. at bay or whatever, and they just waltz right in to TSMC's front door, and they're like, "Hey, the new boss is here." They don't win diddly because when you run a fab, you have to know how that fab works, and it's not like you drove a Honda one day and you drive a Toyota or a Mercedes the next day. I'm talking about cars you all drive, and not me. I'm not in that league. But so when you go into a new fab, if you've not been there before and you weren't there when it was built and you don't have the instruction manual, you can't really run it. In addition, these fabs, again, they just take orders and then they produce. They don't design themselves. So if the rest of the world stops sending orders to TSMC, there's nothing to produce. So in addition, they need raw materials, electricity, very complex stuff to actually run a fab. And that stuff could get, those inventories would dry up pretty quickly. In addition, it all operates on software tools and equipment that the US and others provide. So it didn't be too hard. Let's just say the folks inside TSMC go, I'm going to work for you guys. And, we just need to keep producing chips. Someone else somewhere else could flip a few lines of code and it would be really hard to run run TSMC. So, and the others. So I think the Chinese know that you just don't go in and take over a fab and force it to produce for you. I hope they know that. If they don't, we're in big trouble. We do know that if TSMC goes offline, the prices of stuff is going to go up. We're all going to be in a very difficult situation. We didn't invent the global semiconductor industry's current structure expecting there to be a new Cold War with TSMC right on the border of that alignment. We invented it by chance because of its efficiency in each area, each country, region specializing in what was best for it. So we now have a serious tension between the geopolitical order and the geoeconomic order.
So, Scott, I experienced that the high prices or shortage of goods from semiconductor production firsthand because, I'm a working class guy from New Hampshire, Scott. I don't drive a Mercedes. I bought a brand new Subaru and there was like a month waiting period. So I experienced that firsthand and understand. One of the few countries I have been internationally, and it was on a co-delegation when I was doing some policy stuff on the Hill, is Taiwan. And I wanted to follow up here as the last question we have for you is when we went over there, we held a lot of meetings and it became very clear early on that the elites in Taiwan, this was like 2014 or something like that, are almost inextricably linked to the manufacturing on the mainland in China. And that a war, like you were saying, a hot war is less likely than some type of economic coercion taking place over, a decade or two, in a slow march to encroachment over Taiwan, and really just forcing these policies on the island by, coercing the elites, so on and so forth, economics and stuff like that. So I guess, is that a potential path that this type of wolf warrior diplomacy and, China's goal of potentially taking back Taiwan could look like? And then the follow up here, to end on a positive note, is there anything the U.S. Can do to create a global coalition to weaken this type of economic coercive power that China currently has over Taiwan?
Those are great questions. We all ought to be thinking about them, because if there's going to be a hot war between the U.S. and China or others, Taiwan's the most likely spark to that, right? And I'm hearing a lot of fatalism when I was in China, a lot of fatalism in Washington, D.C. And, I'm really worried we're going to talk ourselves into a conflict that we should be able to avoid. And we should be able to avoid it. We have a pretty good idea of where everyone's red lines are. And there is a pretty good balance of power that makes anyone taking a move really dumb, because they're putting their entire country at risk. And I think most folks know that. Nevertheless, we're talking ourselves into a potential conflict. I think everybody is, and we need to take a big chill pill on this. When I was in Taiwan in the spring, and then again in September on my way to China, obviously high levels of anxiety and stuff. But I think also a recognition that Taiwan has some advantages or some leverage that they want to utilize, and that decoupling full stop with China is not possible for them. I mean, 42% of Taiwan's exports go to mainland China or Hong Kong. U.S. is 8.6%. The U.S. could actually potentially think about that. It's probably not reality, but in Taiwan, when 42% are going, and half of that is semiconductors, you're not decoupling. So instead of that, what the Taiwanese, I think, have done is figured out how to be indispensable to China. Semiconductor manufacturing is at the heart of that indispensability argument. Yes, they have monster leverage over us. They're 1.4 billion people. We're 23 million. That's not even the population of Shanghai. But yet we've got this incredible technology, which is absolutely invaluable, which everybody needs. And if it goes offline, everybody suffers. So I think the way that the Taiwanese think about this, in addition to that more comprehensively, is, yes, they're restricting certain Chinese imports into Taiwan, massive investment screening system into China and from China into Taiwan, big restrictions on Taiwanese working in Chinese companies. Yet no thought that they want to diversify and expand trade with Southeast Asia and elsewhere. But that's not a strategy to isolate China or to eliminate commercial interaction. That is because what they want to do is shape that commercial interaction in a way that most is advantageous to Taiwan economically and national security wise. So instead of decoupling or partially decoupling, what they're doing is what I call calibrated coupling. They've figured out what's the best way to structure that relationship that's in my self-interest. Don't pay attention to the rules of the WTO or some other agency. What really works for me? And I think that's what the Taiwanese are trying to do. It is a big debate there. I did find lots of people extremely worried about overdependence. That 42% number gets mentioned all the time, and they've not been able to lower it. But diversification, not decoupling, I think and calibrated coupling is, I think, what they want to do. One other story about, but in the long term, I'm still worried, because the identity is not something that you split down the middle and give you 50% and the other side 50% and fix this. When I was in China, on my plane ride from San Francisco to Taipei, on my way to mainland China in September, was the Little League World Series baseball team of Chinese Taipei, right? 12 and 13-year-old kids, super cool. The pilot announced they were on the plane. Everyone applauds. Say it in Chinese. Everyone applauds again. You get off the plane. These kids are putting data into their phones, because they've got to go through quarantine in Taipei. Very, very cute. asking their moms and their coaches and dads for help and everything. I was just super impressed by them. And, every year they rock in Williamsport. So I asked a lot of people when I was in China, hey, I told them the story about the kids on the plane. And then I asked them the question, who do those kids play for? Are they your team? And I got mixed answers. Some said, of course they're our team. Taipei, Kunming, Wuhan, it's all the same, right? We're just all one China. A lot of people said, no, they're not our team. And like, oh, are you sure you want to say that? Sure you want that to be your answer? That doesn't sound like the politically correct answer. So then I asked them the next follow-up if they said they're our team. I said, who do you think the kids play for? You think the kids think they play for you? And that was a harder answer. Most of them said, no, they think they play for Taiwan. So that's a big challenge. Some of them then said, well, you know what the problem is? They need to be properly educated. That's not what people want to see. And then in Taiwan, they say like, it's not us that needs to be educated. It's you guys that need to be educated. So that's an identity challenge that is really going to be hard to fix. It's not easily fixable whatsoever. So I'm worried that we're going to get ahead of ourselves and someone is going to forget about these kids. And we got to remember those kids. They're not just baseball players, they're people. And they should have a bright future. And the rest of us adults, whether we're in Taipei, Washington, D.C., Cambridge, or Beijing, ought to figure out how to solve this problem. I do think that there's some things that the U.S. can do to continue to maintain a balance of power and also to continue to talk to Beijing and Taipei. But I think we also need to talk to ourselves and not let our own domestic politics about scoring big on China force us to make actions that end up creating more risk than there ought to be. I think members of Congress genuinely usually want to do the right thing and they want to stick up for a smaller place like Taiwan. On the other hand, these visits to Taipei aren't necessarily helping Taiwan. And the Taiwan Policy Act that Congress is considering may have a lot of things that actually just raise the temperature rather than lower the temperature. So I think we need to be judicious with our use of our power and how we engage in conversation. At the end of the day, Taiwan, that's a political issue, not a military issue. And so we've got to be the best diplomats that we possibly can be.
Thank you very much for joining us today, Scott.
Really appreciate it.